In the last book of the New Testament, we're told of a scroll that sits in God's right hand, sealed with 7 seals. When the Lion of Judah opens 4 of these seals, it summons forth 4 horsemen, one astride a white horse, another on a red horse, one on a black horse, and the last on a pale horse. These are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that symbolize conquest, war, famine, and disease. The Christian view is that the 4 horsemen set a divine apocalypse upon the world as the harbingers of the last judgment. Even though the book of Revelation was probably written some 1900 years ago, the general consensus is similar. The planet is currently not in a good state, and we're accelerating towards a global catastrophe as a consequence of environmental change. As such, if I were to rewrite the prophecy of an apocalypse now, then the 4 horsemen would be biodiversity loss, climate change, environmental degradation, and disease emergence. In both of these, the disease issue remains, and remains a major threat. But the perspective has changed because it is now not so much about human-induced strife, such as war, that generates disease, but human-induced impacts on the environment that shape how the disease risk increases. How does this operate? Of course, many of these drivers are not independent. They all interact and emerge as a consequence of the increase in the human population and the demand for food, space, and other resources. Now, in disease ecology, we have a nice hypothesis that links biodiversity loss and disease emergent together. And this hypothesis is called the dilution hypothesis. Essentially, this states that disease risk to humans is negatively related to biodiversity. That means that as biodiversity falls, so the risk of infection to humans increases. And it means that biodiversity can be seen as an important protector of human health. Environmental degradation, habitat loss, and fragmentation lead to certain species falling out of the ecosystem. The first to go are obviously the large carnivores, followed by the larger herbivores, and ultimately the last species are the smaller rodent species. The idea behind the hypothesis is that the last species to remain in a community are called the most resilient, and coincidentally are also the most competent hosts for disease transmission. They are the species that amplify the disease, and so increase the risk of humans becoming infected. Well, does this occur? The classic study on this has been some very detailed studies of Lyme disease that have been undertaken in upstate New York. Lyme disease is a tick-borne infection transmitted between many host species, including humans, by the bite of an infected tick, usually the nymph stage. In this system, the white-footed mouse is the most competent host and is responsible for much of the amplification. As biodiversity is lost, so the mouse tends to remain. It's the last host, and so more and more of the ticks bite the mouse host and disease prevalence increases, and so the risk to humans increases. The fact that the mouse is both the most competent host and the most resilient could be a complete coincidence, but raises a more general question: are the resilient hosts often the more competent hosts? Interestingly, if we look at rodents, they've been the source of many, many zoonotic infections, important infections for humans, including hantavirus, leptospirosis, plague. And since rodents tend to be the most resilient species because they adapt to human houses and presence, this could be a very important finding. Interestingly, a very recent study has produced evidence showing that bats also harbour many, many zoonotic infections per species. In fact, more than rodents, and could be a very important source of zoonotic disease. It seems that bats share their infection with other species much more readily than rodents do. How resilient bats are to habitat change is not apparent, and there's much more investigation needed to elucidate this. Of course, these environmental drivers, these terms, all interact. Climate change, host availability, and habitat structure all work together to shape the likelihood of a new disease emerging or a new outbreak starting in humans. There's little doubt that disease issues, and particularly emerging zoonotic infections, are going to be increasing issues in the future. Of course, what we would really like to do is predict where and when the next SARS-like epidemic is going to emerge. But in reality, we can't do this. We simply don't know what is out there and the likelihood of emergence. We can draw maps, come up with correlations, but strictly speaking, these are meaningless without a deep understanding of the mechanisms involved. So what skill sets do the people of the future need to study these diseases? Well, the whole raison d'etre of this course has been to show you that there are a large number of skills needed. In particular, we can't study infections in isolation. We need an appreciation of the dynamics of transmission, the resistance and the susceptibility of the hosts. We really must bring the social sciences closer to the disease scientists so we can appreciate the behaviour of people and their responses much better. We need to have an appreciation of the cross-scale issues that run from protein to pandemic, and use mathematical models that can help capture our understanding and allow us to ask important questions, intervention questions like, who do we really need to vaccinate to stop transmission? How many people do we need to vaccinate to eliminate this disease? When should we vaccinate? How can we break these chains of transmission? How is the infection going to evolve around our intervention strategies? And are we going to see cases getting worse? Disease dynamics are global issues, and it seems somewhat obvious to me that no single expert can really have the toolbox of interdisciplinary skills necessary to reveal the biological and social mechanisms of disease dynamics. Not only do we need teams of people that cover multiple skills, but many of the rising issues are indeed in developing countries, in the Far East and in Africa. We need expertise on the ground. So the real challenge is to train people in these countries to undertake the research and development. Now, in the past, much of the efforts we put into capacity building in places like African countries produced people with the skills, but many of these are sucked into senior administrative positions before they have a real chance to make a real difference on the ground. In the future, to tackle these disease problems, we need the trained local people working within a team of experts, working together with their own community, identifying the issues and being able to see when the diseases are coming up and how we can control them. And I think that is a very important challenge for the future.